It was nearly dusk when Eleanor Reynolds pressed her hand against the cold glass of her living room window, watching the orange sky smear itself into purples and shadows across the horizon. She had done this most evenings for the past 8 years, ever since Harold passed, and the house had gone quiet in a way that no television or ticking clock could fill. The Vermont farmhouse, which once buzzed with life and laughter, now echoed only the soft shuffle of her wool slippers against hardwood floors and the sighs that escaped without her permission. Eleanor was 72. Her hair, once a deep chestnut, now shimmered like winter's frost, but she wore it in the same soft curls Harold had always loved. She still set the table for two sometimes. Not out of delusion, she was far too practical for that, but because it somehow made the silence less confrontational. She had children, of course. Paul in Chicago, a tax consultant with 2 teenagers of his own, and Marcy, a ceramic artist living somewhere near Portland. They called every so often, sent gifts at Christmas, but their voices always seemed hurried, distant, as if she existed in a separate orbit from their chaotic solar systems. That evening, she wandered toward the old studio at the edge of the property, a weathered wooden shed that Harold had built her when she turned 50, back when she still painted. She hadn't stepped foot inside in nearly a decade. The key still hung on a rusty hook beside the door, covered in cobwebs and dry leaves. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned the lock. The air inside was stale with time and old oils. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light breaking through the wood slats, illuminating the easel that still stood in the corner, blank canvas in place, as if waiting patiently for her return. Brushes sat dry in cracked jars, their bristles stiff and frayed, yet somehow defiant of being discarded. A sudden ache rose in her chest. Not sadness, but something gentler, something like nostalgia laced with longing. Eleanor walked in slowly, fingers trailing along the wooden workbench, as if reacquainting herself with a forgotten limb. She found her old apron, folded neatly as she'd left it, and slipped it over her head. The ties still knew their way around her waist. The next morning, after years of blank pages and unopened paints, Eleanor began again. The first stroke was shaky, a hesitant swipe of ochre across the canvas, but something inside her responded like a whisper. She painted until her back ached and her coffee grew cold, and then painted some more. In the following weeks, she returned to the studio every morning, brushing life back into the walls with every layer of color. Landscapes at first, then still life, then, eventually, herself. Not as she was, but as she had felt. Strong, stormy, soft. Layers of expression emerged in oil and light. And with it, something shifted in her body. Not a transformation, but a homecoming. She began waking earlier. She cooked elaborate meals again, not because anyone would eat them with her, but because she deserved the scent of rosemary and garlic in the air. She cleaned out Harold's old dresser and filled it with linens she bought from the local market, cheerful prints that didn't match the house but made her smile anyway. One morning, while picking up supplies in town, she passed a community center with a poster pinned to the window. Artists over 60, reclaiming identity through paint. The exhibit was set to open in 3 months. Without overthinking, she jotted down the contact information and sent in her name the same afternoon. Weeks later, she stood in the gallery space, her hands tucked into her coat pockets, staring at her piece titled Return. The canvas depicted a woman walking barefoot through fog, one hand reaching toward a light no one else could see. She hadn't expected much. Few polite nods, maybe, some idle chatter. But instead, a woman approached her, tall, silver-haired, draped in a shawl dyed with sunset hues. "You're the one who painted that, aren't you?" she asked softly, her eyes shining with emotion. It made me cry. I felt seen. Eleanor blinked, overwhelmed. "Thank you," she managed, her voice quiet. "You reminded me I'm still here," the woman said, placing a hand over her own chest. Still a woman, not just a memory. That night, Eleanor sat on her porch, her piece sold and spoken of, and looked up at the stars. The quiet had changed. Not gone, but gentler. Like an old friend who knew when to give you space and when to sit beside you in silence. And so, her days became full again. Not with noise, but with meaning. She began teaching classes at the center twice a week. She wrote letters to her children that weren't just holiday updates but stories. Her stories. Of painting again, of crying in the studio, of dancing barefoot in the kitchen when the brushstrokes came out right. Paul called more often now. Marcy sent photos of her latest pottery. And once, a sketch she'd done of Eleanor painting. The resemblance was imperfect, but the spirit was there. It wasn't about becoming someone new, Eleanor had realized. It was about returning to someone she'd once been. The woman who laughed too loud at her own jokes, who painted until her hands cramped, who wore bright scarves and walked through the world like she still had things to say. 'Cause she did. At 72, Eleanor found her voice again. And this time it was her own.